Okay, we got a Developer Manifesto. Changes. Changes are good. Changes make the game interesting. So Pathfinder is in here. Problem: Pathfinder's Master Alchemist skill is quite weak, which also causes Pathfinder to be pushed mostly towards chaos-based builds, as non-chaos builds do not have enough compelling ascendancy skills to choose from. Okay, there's some truth to that. Add more power to Master Alchemist. Okay, but partially compensate by removing extraneous power from much stronger nature's boon. What do we got? Okay, Master Alchemist notable ascendancy passive skill no longer grants synergy with elementals. 20% free shock and ignite. Okay, and instead now causes magic utility flash applied to you to have 20% increased effect. But only magic and only utility. Okay. Pathfinder's Nature's Boon notable ascendancy passive no longer grants 6% reduced elemental damage taken. This is pretty mediocre, to be fair. So removing this kind of cleans up the ascendancy passive, so that's fine. Removing the elemental synergy. That's confusing. So we removed more some elemental synergy. And what were they trying to solve? Master Alchemist is quite weak. True. Which also casts most towards chaos-based builds. But you made non-chaos builds less appealing because you removed the synergy with elemental ailments. I think that they probably had two different problem statements, and this is one fix, and this is the other problem statement. So we'll look at what the actual patch notes say, but this seems like there is a bit of a disconnect. I don't really see how this really improves things. Magic utility flasks is rough, with 20% increased effect. Now there's utility flasks that give you like onslaught, which does nothing for, or creates chilling ground, which this does nothing for. So this is mainly for the things that just reduce elemental damage taken, right? So there's utility flasks that give you 20% less elemental damage taken. And 20% increased effect of that means that now instead of 20% it's 24%, which is pretty good. Which kind of cancels out the 6% less reduced elemental damage taken. It really locks you into the elemental resist flasks. The problem is that with the introduction of Droughtbringer, relying on the elemental resistance flasks for your elemental resistances means that on occasion you just have none of those resistances, because there's no way to overcome Droughtbringer. So maybe with the armor and evasion flasks, this is an extra 300 armor, an extra 300 evasion. That's not terrible. So yeah, not sure what they were going for. Like the problem and the solution don't. The problem and the solution have truth to them, but the actual implementation should not have passed acceptance testing as far as the actual problem statement goes. So I wonder if there were two things and they kind of took the solution from one and applied it to the problem statement of the first and condensed things down. Anyway, what else do we have for Pathfinder? That's it? Okay. Flask. Blah blah blah. Flask. Ooh, there's more Flask stuff. The line for Flask modifiers that grant Flask charges when you're hit makes it too easy to keep Flask active. Absolutely true. For most non-boss content. It actually helps with boss content too. Lower the value of Flask modifiers granting charges when you're hit. So we go from... ooh, wow. Okay. The The delinquents and sinners modifier can no longer be rolled on flasks. The transgressors, masochist, and flagellants modifiers now provide 1, 2, and 3 when hit by the enemy respectively. Previously 4, 6, and 7. Wow. So they more than nerfed it by half. So the low end is nerfed by 75%, this is nerfed by 66%, and this is nerfed by a little over 50%. Okay. That's rough. That's interesting, right? Because that kind of screws with your flasks that remove elemental ailments. Nobody cares about this part, of course, but that remove elemental ailments whenever you use a flask charge. Because what you could do is you get hit once, you might get shocked, you get hit again, but within those 2 hits you get enough flask charges to pop a flask, which means that now you get to remove that shock. Like this was a meaningful way to avoid shock as Pathfinders using the node that they just removed the other power from. So they hit that node pretty hard. They of course also gutted the other half of the 3 Master Surgeon because Flask Immortality is dead. Okay, well that's interesting. Ward is a relatively niche defensive mechanic, but currently it's mainly strong when paired with the Resolve. Yep, pretty much true. Yeah, it's kind of interesting. The most interesting Flask build, right, using this particular Flask to create Ward Loop, is inaccessible for Pathfinders because increased Flask effect is not a desirable trait. Okay. So that does nothing about Ward Loop. Sniper's Mark provides flash charge generation. Interesting. So they removed that from Sniper's Mark. So no more flash charges from Sniper's Mark. I don't think many people care about that. And then we already looked at this. Okay. Concoction. Explosive? Explosive concoction is not on the list. Ascendancy stuff, unique items, item balance. Anything else in here? Interesting. Okay, so let's take a quick look at Pathfinder. POE wiki. And let's see where we ended up with this. Alright, Control Shift. Alright, so over on this side, we had the Master Surgeon, which gains you flash charge when you deal a critical strike. This became relatively more powerful because it's harder to gain flash charges other ways, like by getting hit. Removes bleeding when you use a flask. This is neat, but we have more tools for that these days. Removes corrupting blood when you have a flask. Again, there's ways to solve this. And recover 6% of life when you use a flask. This got hit by more than 50% because the ability of generating flash charges when you're being hit reduces the effectiveness of this. Also, the problem with this is that you kind of have to hit your flasks pretty short after you're affected by bleeding or corrupting blood. Right? It isn't an issue when your flasks are popping all the time, which you were able to accomplish before, but when they're not popping all the time, then you need to hit the keys, which is a little frustrating and leads to Flask piano, and it means that automating your Flask becomes much more difficult. Okay, so the chaos skill stayed exactly the same, right? Right, so the chaos ability stayed exactly the same. They already recognized that these are the more powerful abilities on the tree, so these became relatively more powerful as this became less powerful. Now, if you look at Master Alchemist, we remove an ailment when you use a flask. This wasn't a big deal when you auto-used your flasks whenever you were hit, right? Because it was pretty good. You'd only be shocked for like 1 or 2 hits. Now, if you get shocked, right, you might get hit 10 times in a second. If your reaction speed isn't good enough, then you're shocked for all of that because you're waiting much longer before your flasks tick. So this is no longer really viable as a way to mitigate shock, which is a problem. This line is deleted. We get 20% increased effect of non-unique magic utility flasks. Interesting. Then we have this movement speed one, attack speed. This one stayed about the same. It's like onslaught but worse because you need a flask effect, for instance. And then we also hit this part. So we no longer have the 6% reduced elemental damage taken. And we just have the chance not to consume charges, which becomes more important as we have to play more flask piano because we can't automate, so we have to over flask to remove ailments. That's gonna really be weird to play. And then we no longer have the 6% reduced elemental damage taken, which isn't really a big deal. Like, unless you were going like Righteous Fire or something like that, it really didn't matter as much. And then Veteran Bowyer is the same as before. We have damage penetration, which was useless because you had the new unique that gave you just insane amounts of penetration, and it's just better to try and ignore enemy resistances than to try and penetrate them. 15% of physicals extra damage from a random element. The drawback with this is that it's not, the cycles aren't locked, right? So if one thing gives you a chance of a random element, another thing gives you a chance for a random element, I don't believe that they will pick the same element. So that makes this a little bit clunky. And then you can gain additional charges when you kill enemies affected by elemental ailments, which is neat, but this is a clearing, nice to have line, right? This is, if they delete this line, I don't think anyone would notice, or if there's a bug with this line, I don't think anyone would notice. So, is penetration different than before? Lower the amount of elemental penetration resistance gained by crystallized omniscience. Crystallized omniscience now has 33% less penetration. Is that accurate? Yes. Used to be 10. Okay. So that became marginally more valuable. So the Chaos Node stayed equivalent in value. The Master Surgeon and Master Alchemist. For Master Alchemist, they effectively deleted both of these lines of text because you can't remove ailments fast enough unless you're fighting a boss or something that hits you very infrequently. But some bosses shotgun, so this is still not really viable. Or you need to, they removed at least part of it. It's probably fine for Ignite, it's not fine for Shock. It's probably okay for Freeze, but again, definitely not okay for Shock. So you need Shock ability, shock reduction or shock mitigation in some way, shape, or form. So they removed a third of this line, being generous, and they removed this line for 20% increased effect of utility flasks. And if you look at utility flasks, blah blah blah, there we go. base types. Okay, so we can get 20% increased critical strike chance. Fire resistance, but with Droughtbringer that's out of the question. So this line is kind of already removed by Droughtbringer. So really it's just about the less fire damage taken most of the time. So less cold damage taken most of the time, less lightning damage taken most of the time. 300 armor, 8% movement speed, 7 chaos resistance, 2% suppression because phasing isn't scaled, 300 evasion, 4% more armor, taunt isn't scaled. We're at 70%, 72% reduced effective freeze. So if you take that 20% node, you get 20% from your ascendancy, so that's 40%. 6 times 1.4, I don't think that's enough. $8.4. Okay, so just with your ascendancy, you're not freeze more than 100% reduced effective freeze on you. Chilling ground isn't scaled. Smoke cloud isn't scaled. Evasion more is scaled. 8% increased damage, that's worth less than 1 ascendancy point. Consecrated ground isn't scaled. Onslaught isn't scaled. Resistance, again, with Droughtbringer you just die on occasion, which is just not worth it. Rarity, oh boy. Stun threshold. And ward. Maybe ward is like where we are looking at now. It gives you an extra 40 ward. I have a hard time seeing that as being worthwhile. That's like 40 life. That's okay. Interesting. Yeah, Pathfinder Alchemist skill is quite weak. They definitely made it weaker. And they definitely pushed Pathfinders more toward chaos-based build. This solution? True. Like, the solution is correct, right? Add more power to Master Alchemist. As Master Alchemist is rough. Removing power from Nature's Boon to make that tree more valuable. Correct. This part, I think this cleans up the ascendancy. This part, I have no idea what they were thinking. Like, this is worse than a mastery and like a notable. Because there's this magic utility flask part of the equation. I don't know what's going on here. I think flasks are going to be cheaper. Buying high level flasks should be a lot cheaper because I think there's going to be fewer people interested in it. The 7 charges whenever you're hit was definitely busted. Going to 3 charges is pretty harsh. So yeah. I don't think that they solved their problem. I think they were on a good track, but this implementation does not line up with the problem and the solution. Like nerfing Pathfinder's ability to just sit in red maps and, you know, go make yourself a coffee or walk to Starbucks, doesn't matter, you're immortal, probably should have been removed. So I understand that part. The problem that they created with that is that because we are triggering flasks less frequently, it's a pretty big hit on Master Alchemist. Right? It's a hit on the other side of the tree, of the ascendancy tree. Right? Getting the Master Surgeon hit, I understand. The Master Alchemist hit is pretty rough. Because this doesn't buy you immunity. And without frequent flask triggers, you're just gonna die to shock. Shock means 30% less life, effectively, on occasion. But shock is pretty prevalent. I'm not quite sure where the wires got crossed. My guess is still that there were two different problem statements and they didn't talk to each other. Right? If you removed, like, a different way to solve this would have been like, hey, I'm gonna remove this line, this magic utility flasks, which also reduces your chase items for the build, which is unfortunate. And instead of saying 20% chance to freeze, shock, ignite during any flask effect, 20% chance for your cold damage to inflict brittle, your lightning damage to inflict sap, and your fire damage to inflict fire during any flask effect. If they had done something like that, then there would be a compelling reason to go Elemental Pathfinder. But what they've done is they've removed some of the elemental synergy and realistically just said, hey, you should be running Poison Chaos Pathfinder, which is literally counter to the original statement. Oh well. I'll be playing Pathfinder. We'll play something different. Is Bone Shatter on here? Bone Shatter is not patched. Or not listed at least. So I'll probably try Bone Shatter. And we should have pretty good time stacking armor and evasion. We actually can use the flasks that give us an extra 300 evasion, an extra 300 armor. Maybe. I just don't think it's worth it. Like, even if I'm just going straight physical with physical scaling, I might just take Veteran Bowyer just for the random 15% extra damage. Can't rely on this. Oh well. So that's Dev Manifesto. We'll see what happens. It's interesting what they have decided to do. I agree with a lot of the different parts. I think that their implementation is gonna probably fall short of their expectations. Nature's Boon is very powerful. The 6% reduced elemental damage taken probably should be removed because it is just extraneous. My prediction is that fewer people will be taking Master Alchemist in next version of POE than previous version of POE. And we might have people walking away from Master Surgeon, which is interesting. Because if you don't take those two nodes, then you're going to be taking Nature's Adrenaline, Nature's Boon. So we have the attack speed, movement speed. We have the flash charges. And if we do make that decision, I mean, if you're elemental, you're taking Veteran Bowyer, and then your last 2 points are whatever. Or you go chaos, in which case you have two pretty potent chaos nodes. So am I going chaos bone shatter? I guess I'm going chaos bone shatter. We'll figure it out. Anyway, I'm happy there's changes. I'm happy that there's a different way to play the game. We'll see how things work out. And we'll see what options we get. Again, all of these things can be completely different. You introduce some interesting utility flask base types, and stacking Flask effect might be super worth it. But I'm not seeing one part of how this implementation correlates to this problem statement. But I assume that they figured it out. We'll see.